Okay. Thank you, Mac. Let me just get my screen sharing going here. Hang on. Okay, is that working?
Yep, you look great.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for that introduction and for having me and for organizing all of these talks over the course of the pandemic. It's been, I know for me, and I'm sure for lots of other people too, really a pleasure to be able to meet together. And it's, means a lot to be here with you all. I really started imagining presenting this book to LAWCHA in some form, like many years before I finished it. And you all are really the audience for whom I wrote it. So lots of people here have had some direct or indirect impact on the book. So thanks for being here and for, all of the ways I've learned from many of you over the years. So I'll talk, like Max said, for about a half hour. And what I want to do is try to both summarize the book and then briefly try to situate it in the field. So this project started from a simple question, which is, where did the working class go after the factory gates closed? To make an argument for the continuing centrality of class in American society and working class power to emancipatory politics after deindustrialization, it'd be good to answer this. Most basically, what jobs were people doing and where had those jobs come from? In many old proletarian cities like New Haven, which you see here, where I went to graduate school, or Philadelphia, where I grew up, local boosters will tell stories about post-industrial reinvention around the population of highly educated creatives and professionals anchored in so-called eds and meds institutions. But this only makes sense if most of the people who actually work for institutions like universities and hospitals are invisible. And actually, if you look, of course, you see workers everywhere, not just engineers and programmers, but nursing assistants and custodians, not to mention, of course, academic workers. So this invisibility became, for me, itself a historical problem to investigate. Where had this new workforce come from? But also, why had no one seemed to notice? I found this especially galling when big newspapers started covering the Rust Belt in 2016. Here's an example of a familiar kind you can see here, never seeming to notice that virtually everyone whom they found to interview in coal towns or steel towns was in fact a healthcare worker, as though these people were pushing their ways into these stories from without. So I chose Pittsburgh as a site to dig into this problem, one of the great cities of the industrial proletariat, where the tallest building today, US Steel Tower, now bears the name of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, the largest private employer in the state. In 2013, the non-union UPMC claimed before the NLRB, in the context of a dispute with SEIU, that it had no employees. And this was surprising because the hospital chain then had over 50,000 employees, and today the number is near 100,000. So at one level, obviously, this was an incidence of the fissuring of the employment relationship, similar to what's practiced by McDonald's or Uber. But it's a mistake to see it as something new in a straightforward way, neoliberalism of the same kind that we kind of talk about all the time and can recognize easily. And that's because in 1940, in response to a short-lived CIO organizing campaign, Pittsburgh's hospitals sought and won an injunction from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which clarified that they were not employers. In 1947, Taft-Hartley further clarified things, exempting hospitals from the NLRA as charitable institutions. From that moment to the 2013 UPMC episode, I think is best seen not as a before and after, but as a continuity. The care economy developed in the post-war decades as the shadow of the industrial economy. One was regulated and relatively secure, governed through labor law, functioning as the private sector allocator of social rights like retirement and healthcare. The other stood outside the protections of the New Deal state, and indeed developed as a kind of adjunct to service the relatively more protected welfare state insiders, people like Pittsburgh steelworkers. These are the opposite sides of what Lane Wyndham calls in her book, Labor's Door, the portal to economic security for working class people found in unionized employment. Collective bargaining in manufacturing on the inside of the door built up the healthcare industry on the outside. And then deindustrialization, which was a grinding generational process and not just a sudden snap in 1979, accelerated healthcare's takeoff further. Because health insurance became linked to employment by collective bargaining in the post-war years, the healthcare economy developed unevenly across the country and is still concentrated today in what were once industrial centers. This is a list of large urbanized counties rank ordered by how much of their workforce is in the category called healthcare and social assistance. And a quick look at this list is all it takes to recognize the pattern. Once again, the shadow of the industrial economy. But before fully diving into the history of healthcare, I want to take a few minutes and talk about the world of steel, which the first couple chapters of the book deal with. To capture the ongoing flux of class composition, something happening all the time, I didn't want to tell a story that began or ended in the 1970s, as I think we often do. I wanted to put the 1970s in the middle of the book to show the world that deindustrialization struck and figure out what historical conditions made it possible for industrial cities to be rearranged in the way that they have been since the 1970s. Labor historians, I think, have largely come to agree that there was never really a post-war labor capital accord. But this insight has not fully filtered down to the social historical level, it seems to me, to ask what it meant in everyday working class life that the victories won by workers, while transformative compared to the previous generation's experience, were simultaneously still so tenuous. In basic steel, the problems that would eventually consume the industry had already appeared by the 1950s. Management had overbuilt capacity with obsolescent technology for war production. Wages were rising much faster than productivity. The industry remained profitable throughout the post-war period, but its margins were shrinking. Every administration from Truman onward, concerned about inflation, spent significant effort trying to prevent steel prices from rising too fast. And this is, again, a story we know well from Judith Stein and many others. But raising prices was the preferred way for these companies to preserve their margins. Meanwhile, lower cost imports were creeping into the US market. For steelworkers, the experience of the post-war years was far more turbulent than we may remember, much as Daniel Clark has recently shown for auto workers in Detroit. From 1930 to 1960, Pittsburgh's economy grew at half the national rate of growth. There was a recession, an industry-wide strike, or both, in 1946, 1949, 1952, 1956, 1957, 1958, 1959, 1960, and 1961, along with numerous small-scale stoppages, like the wildcat strike over work rules pictured here. As steel management tried to maintain its margins in the face of pressure on prices, both from the federal government and international competitors, it was impelled to engage in relentless shop floor conflict with workers over the pace of production. And again, this is the backdrop in Jack Metzger's great book that I'm sure all of us know well. This was the origin of the great 1959 strike, years of sustained effort to speed up labor, piling up grievances like the one you see an excerpt of here, and accumulating bitterness on the shop floor. When Nixon had his kitchen debate with Khrushchev in Moscow in 1959, virtually the first thing he mentioned was how easy things were for American housewives. And the second was the fact that steelworkers could afford the model home that they were looking at, even though right then they were on strike. We think of the working class in this period, we think of consumerism, home ownership, the new domesticity. But here too, there are important contradictions in working class life that arose from workers' tenuous hold on economic security and the role of families in general and women in particular in managing that insecurity. Steelworkers by the early 60s averaged $3.36 an hour, $3.36 an hour, equivalent to about $30 today, annualized for a full-time working year. This would have put them at $6,720, comfortably above the standard that the Bureau of Labor Statistics described, and here you can see a kind of summary, as, quote, moderate but adequate for Pittsburgh. That standard included only tenancy, not home ownership, a used car, a few items of clothes each year for each of the kids, only a small family, 2 kids. And in fact, steelworker households did not, on average, clear the standard because you couldn't annualize that $3.36 an hour. They didn't enjoy a full-time working year most of the time, and so they came in on average below $6,199. It thus fell to women in these households to successfully carry out working class social reproduction in an environment that was both more comfortable generally than anything their parents knew, and less secure than everyone constantly told them they were supposed to be. Pittsburgh had a far lower women's labor force participation rate than the country as a whole, because its division of labor was organized so heavily around male earning and women's unwaged reproductive labor. This didn't mean that women did less work or that families were sites of affluence and leisure. They were lean days, remembered Joyce Henderson. We had to put cardboard in our shoes. I had 3 outfits. I had a couple of skirts, a couple of blouses, and every day I had to rotate them. She washed her underwear every day on the washboard. Her family had a washing machine, but she needed to save on electricity. Mrs. C, this is from a oral history collection that's anonymized, so you'll hear some initials like that throughout the talk. Mrs. C canned and made her own sausage. Quote, I thought it was cheaper. I do that. My mother never did that. Earlene Coburn remembered how her grandmother would, quote, go out to a farm or wherever, and she'd come back with all these vegetables and fruit, and she canned. She canned greens, she canned string beans, she made soup, she canned that, she made homemade jelly. She did all kind of stuff like that. So that when he got laid off or went on strike, all we'd have to worry about was the meat. Wives often had to cook multiple dinners per day as men got home from the mill at all hours. They cleaned and scrubbed constantly, chipping industrial silt out of the washing machine, scrubbing down work clothes with lard to remove grease, cleaning soot from windows, doing laundry in the middle of the night, rushing to get clothes off the line when they heard a siren from the mill warning of sooty emissions coming. They tended to the young, the old, and the sick, as well as their husbands, who came home from sped up work, tired, alienated, often sullen or angry, occasionally drunk. You were on call 24 hours a day, recalled Pat Siebert, who was both a wife and daughter of steelworkers. You never got any rest. Kids came home from school and you get them all night by yourself. Then your husband comes home at midnight and is raring to go. And so you're not asleep until 2 a.m. Then you're up with the kids at 6 or 7. You're more tired than he was. So who was entitled to care and who was obliged to form heterosexual nuclear families to provide that care? This is a political question. It was determined at a social level, as we know from Alice Kessler Harris and Margot Canaday and many others. Yet the problem was lived out in individual lives privately, as women labored to make real the security that they were supposed to have and yet somehow did not. As the industrial economy went through its long secular decline, it tested the capacity of households to absorb disruption. Many depended on each other in extended kinship and neighborhood systems, which the book explores at length. Some protested and resisted in various ways, demanding fairer employment for African-American men in industry who were hit first and hardest by job loss, or welfare rights for African-American women. But in aggregate, erosion of industrial work created a poorer, older, and sicker working class population. In a heavily unionized regional labor market, the decline of employment punished the young with particular intensity due to seniority. This general mechanism interacted with a particular cohort effect in Pittsburgh. Steel employment had risen to its peak during the Korean War, meaning that the cohort hired during the long military industrial expansion in the 40s and 50s would be the largest and never fully replaced thereafter. The workforce, therefore, aged noticeably over several decades. And this industrial level process was the nucleus of a larger change in the regional age structure as the young emigrated and left the outsized elderly cohort behind. Pittsburgh's population over 65 grew at twice the national rate. And by 1990, Allegheny County would be the second oldest urbanized county in the United States after Broward in Florida. But there was, in this context, a kind of surprising source of economic security, health insurance. And here I'll return to where I started. The steelworkers negotiated their first health plan in 1949, in the moment when industrial unions turned to the private sector for welfare benefits, after the failure of Truman's universal healthcare proposal, as we know from Alan Derrickson, Jennifer Klein, Colin Gordon. In fact, it was in a pair of 1949 steel industry cases that the court system held up welfare benefits as mandatory subjects of collective bargaining. After a decade and a few strikes, steelworkers and their dependents had a very impressive benefit package, including zero contribution to premiums by 1960. Huge groups of industrial workers in places like Pittsburgh, who were generally on the younger side early in the post-war period, again, since hiring had peaked around 1950, they formed the actuarial basis for a booming healthcare market. By the end of the 50s, 5 to 6% of all enrollment nationwide in Blue Cross, the country's largest insurer, was affected just by steel industry contract negotiations. So in response to this emerging market, providers grew. They built new wings, they bought new machines, they offered new services. With this, costs rose, pricing out those who were left on the margins, the poor and the elderly. So in this way, the rise of collectively bargained private benefits stimulated the political demand for the expansion of public social insurance, eventually taking the shape of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965 to cover those who were being priced out. But importantly, Medicare and Medicaid did not interfere with the private core of the health system, only rounding out its rough edges. Then beginning in the late 1960s, demand for healthcare rose very rapidly as the population at an aggregate level was now very well insured, rapidly aging, and also increasingly economically destabilized by advancing job loss. What does this look like in practice? A steelworker retires in the 1970s. His sons leave town. They move to Florida and Texas looking for work. His daughter's married, but her husband is saying they should leave too since he can't find good work. She doesn't want to leave her parents behind. She's used to taking care of them and expects to do so as they get older. So she figures she should get a job, breaking the pattern of her housewife mother. This means she won't be able to spend so much time looking after her parents, but that's all right. They have that retiree insurance, and they can use it to get low-level, non-intensive care at little cost, even as inpatients in the hospital. So the retiree becomes a patient, his daughter becomes a nurse. As the process of industrial decline reverberated through the population of steelworkers and their dependents, it thus played out in the form of increasing patient demand. Utilization of health services, which is the horrible word that they use in health policy, utilization, rose across the 1970s, with steelworkers, their retirees, and their dependents leading the trend. By 1979, the region generated 1.6 inpatient days per person that year. That was 23% higher than the national level at the time. It's triple our national level today. Through the 1970s, a wave of hospital capacity expansion, financed with cheap municipal debt, accommodated this rising demand. With social insurance, both public and private/nonprofit, guaranteeing profitable reimbursement, hospitals had every reason to do more volume, to borrow and to build. Much of this care was non-intensive, non-acute, something closer to nursing home care than how we today think of hospital care. That is, it consisted mostly of labor, not capital. A lot of what was provided was help with toileting, washing bodies, changing sheets, bringing food, listening, reassuring, administering medication. As one steelworker's wife put it in the 1970s, when you're feeling the way I did, everybody seems to be good because you're miserable, and so they're nice with you. So I always had a good stay in the hospital. The food, everybody complained. I enjoyed it. Lay in bed, somebody serve you food. What could be more? So this was a labor-intensive business, and health institutions had to have a cheap pool of labor to draw on. They fought to keep it cheap. In 1969, 1970, a large group of mainly Black workers joined Local 1199 in Pittsburgh and carried out a series of actions at local hospitals, particularly a flagship academic institution, Presbyterian University Hospital. But they had no legal protection. They were not covered by the NLRA. And the hospital could treat them, as they put it in this pamphlet you see, like they were, quote, second-class citizens or on a plantation. The hospital invited in a rival union to confuse matters. It fired strikers. It had some number arrested for picketing. And in this way, it was able to crush the drive quite effectively. And by the way, the co-chairman of the Committee to Secure Justice for Hospital Workers during this fight was David Montgomery. So the defeat of workers' organizations, along with larger structural pressures on the industry, held wages low, kept jobs bad. Overwhelmingly, hospitals and nursing homes hired women made available for employment because their earnings were needed to lessen the impact of the vanishing family wage, formerly made possible by men's full-time union jobs. This process of women's entrance into the labor market occurred unevenly along racial lines, with longer work histories for African-American women who began moving from domestic work into institutionalized care in large numbers during the 1960s. Over the next decade, white women needing to compensate for lost industrial wages joined them, often with opportunity to enter higher up on the occupational ladder. In general, however, women were pre-qualified for these jobs by their preparation in the patriarchal working class family, where they had been, quote, trained to care for much of their lives, as one recruiter put it. So the healthcare system was now taking on some of the work once done in the family. This counter-cyclical aspect of healthcare industry growth intensified further after 1979, when the Federal Reserve triggered a recessionary cycle that pushed industrial work from a long, slow decline into a rapid tailspin. As mills shut down entirely, unemployment in the Pittsburgh area soared, reaching 17% in 1983. All the dynamics that had gradually been stressing the population and pushing healthcare demand upward went into overdrive in this catastrophe. Addiction, malnutrition, housing insecurity, heart disease, domestic violence, stress, and depression all proliferated. A 2009 study by economists found a 50 to 100% increase in what they call mortality hazard, that is, likelihood of dying, during the years immediately following job loss in Pennsylvania in the early 1980s. An overtaxed social safety net, stretched to breaking by federal and state austerity, proved nowhere near capable of handling the task that this situation represented. And family networks, once a buffer, were completely overwhelmed. Even those who had saved, observed one laid-off steelworker, now were out of money. Ron McMunn, a Homestead steelworker, was laid off in 1983. I worked all them years at the plant, he said, and I have nothing now. I feel all tied up. I feel like I've been all balled up tight for so long now. I lost my wife and my family. I used to get very angry. All the time I was filled up with hatred. Harry Rhodes, a millwright, hanged himself on May 17th, 1985, a week after he relented to early retirement. I can't go on without working, read his suicide note. A psychiatric aide at San Francisco Hospital remembered, quote, a lot more people thinking about suicide, I would say. So he spent a lot of time making sure that they knew that somebody loved them, whether or not they worked. In this context, the healthcare system proved the only part of the social state, besides the prison system, able to expand in tandem with the crisis. Medicaid expanded countercyclically as more people became poor and so qualified for it, with the statewide outlay growing from $1.2 billion in 1979 to $1.6 billion by 1983. And Medicare scooped up a growing portion of the aging community, again, relatively buffered from the austerity elsewhere in the welfare state. The private benefits negotiated in collective bargaining also proved a key source of income for devastated communities. Steelworker retiree benefits, which some qualified for potentially as young as 45, they're very complicated retirement formulas in the steelworker contract, injected $123 million into the mill towns of the Monongahela Valley in 1985 alone. And that, by the way, is according to a study by Edward Montgomery, David's son, the economist. So Blue Cross, Medicare, and Medicaid were together worth a lot. And even as high interest rates choked off investment in the industrial economy, capital investment into healthcare institutions in the region tripled. Hospital revenues increased in the recession. They attracted more investment in the recession. They grew by feeding on the ruin that no one else could or would manage. And the pattern found in Pittsburgh is regional in scale. It's common across the deindustrialized zones of the Northeast and Midwest. Sorry, that slide was for a moment ago. There you can see the tripling of capital investment. In 1981, for example, Pittsburgh ranked 24th among cities by average length of hospital stay. You can see on this list what kinds of cities ranked 1 to 23. Only Washington, D.C. breaks the pattern. All of the rest are industrializing cities. So you have this one stream of income, which keeps flowing even as everything else is getting cut off, and a population that increasingly, therefore, are going to become patients so they can use it to stay alive. With that, it keeps adding jobs, particularly as men are being pushed out of secure industrial work. Women flood into these jobs, especially African-American women, into the lower ranks. These were low-paying jobs. They were insecure, but they were growing, and everything else was collapsing. You can see here that by 1992, 64% of the workforce was occupationally below the level of registered nurses. So that's from this category downward. The idea of healthcare and of the service economy as a kind of high-skill, high-wage, middle-class industry was proven pretty quickly to be a total fantasy. Again, like the carceral state, the healthcare system expanded to absorb the social damage and dislocation of deindustrialization. That manifests as health inflation, right? Healthcare absorbs more of the economy, more of our national income goes into the healthcare system, and costs go up. But health inflation isn't an autonomous phenomenon. It's a measure of this kind of shock absorber effect. As healthcare costs ballooned in the early 1980s, Congress became anxious and passed a major reform to Medicare in '83, which made it more costly for hospitals to admit patients for less acute conditions and to hold them for a long time. The result of this was to transfer more kind of chronic and low-level care out of hospitals and into nursing homes and home care, in turn accelerating the growth of those low-wage labor markets across the 80s and 90s and down to the present. Care jobs, broadly defined, accounted for an incredible 56% of new low-wage jobs in the US in the 1980s, 63% in the 1990s, and 72% in the 2000s. This is because care has been our system for absorbing and managing the damage of deindustrialization. We can see here the reproduction of racial and gender hierarchy in and through labor market processes, and equally, the reconstruction of labor markets since industrial decline has depended on pre-existing hierarchies of race and gender. Structurally, one distinctive quality of the care economy is the limited opportunity for productivity growth. It's hard to get more care per hour out of workers without degrading the care that they give. From the perspective of workers, this limit manifests as downward pressure on wages and especially on staffing, so as stress. Understaffing is endemic. Workers have too much to do and not enough time. And this remains true now, but it was a reality that emerged in the early 1980s. The organization 9 to 5 reported that the industry that stands out as very stressful is the healthcare industry. Or as one LPN put it, I had 2 miscarriages. I get migraine headaches if I get overly tired. At the end of a 7-day stretch, I have a tension headache like you wouldn't believe. I come home and my 2 days off, I'm sick. Then I go back to work. And this returns us to the present. And I think one of the many painful lessons of the last year, the paradox of so-called essential work. Care workers are responsible for everyone. They hold our society together, but no one is responsible for them. They're collectively indispensable, but individually disposable. And this was true long before the pandemic. The reproduction of our society rests on them, and it seems like it ought to give them great power, potentially, to lead the working class more broadly in some way, but it's power that they have not yet found. Okay, so that takes me to the end of the summary of the book, and I want to just quickly wrap up. I'm going to do it on time. Okay, I'll take a couple minutes and quickly wrap up by just talking about where I sort of hope the project fits in the development of the field of labor history. When I started grad school, the crisis of labor history still seemed very much in effect. I remember a senior scholar saying to me at one point, labor history, you're still making that? When I told him what I was interested in. And this was an intellectual and political problem we've all experienced, obviously, in some form. But most urgently, for me as a graduate student and for my friends and my comrades, it was a professional problem. The work of labor historians needed more recognition as employment prospects seemed tied up with that recognition. So I wanted to, I missed a slide again here. So I want to understand the genealogy of the field and to try to figure out how to situate myself in relation to the huge debate that had happened in the 80s and 90s. And in this way, I hope to contribute in this book to what Leon Fink called in his 2011 essay, The Field's Great Escape. So that essay points out that the field's new intellectual vitality comes from two sources. First, attention to labor market, quote, outsiders, workers whose labor was undervalued or unvalued, coerced or unrecognized, often a status constituted through gender, race, and nationality. And second, historical attention to the specificity of institutions, both of capital and of state, which structure the power relationships within which workers find themselves. Both these avenues of inquiry emerged in the 90s and 2000s in response to the crisis of the field, which was itself rooted, it seems to me, in the defeat of the New Deal order. That defeat was such an intellectual blow because of how the field itself had grown up in relation to the institutions of the New Deal state and the working class formation that underlay it. The world of the new labor historians was the world the CIO made. Many were born in working class and immigrant families in the urban industrial North, educated at public institutions during the post-war boom. So long as industrial unions and the New Deal state were strong, they could tell a coherent story. The industrial worker was still a kind of universal subject in principle, able to stand in for the working class as a whole. So the defeat of that working class formation in the 70s and 80s led to the crisis of the field. I don't think this is news to anyone here, since it called into question the universality of the industrial working class that had made the New Deal. In this context, did it make sense to see a singular working class, or was the story necessarily pluralistic? Hence the problem, as the famous 1984 conference put it, of synthesis, which was summarized in this book. This, of course, is the origin of these new lines of inquiry that Leon described, outsiders and institutions. But how to pursue these without conceding the central place of the working class in US history? Without a kind of universal subject, weren't these just two kinds of stories among many? So this was the historiographical problem I wanted to try to work on in the book, because the question of universality seemed to me in this context less like a kind of theoretical assumption we could depend upon in the way that I think it probably would have seemed to me in 1975. The idea that workers' interests are automatically everyone's interests, and more like a historical problem to investigate, something about which we need to ask, under what conditions, through what institutions, does working class universalism become possible? And finally, this seemed to me tied up with a kind of substantive question about how to narrate the end of the New Deal order. Like I said, a lot of the scholarship in US history tends to treat the long 1970s as a kind of hard punctuation point, separating periods. And if you look at it that way, deindustrialization, the political right turn, the rise of neoliberalism appear as subtractive. They reduce what was there, and the resulting story is one that we understand in terms of loss. Unions collapse, communities decline, the welfare state contracts, and so on. Obviously, this is important from the perspective of the immense and real harm inflicted on real people. But I think we don't always allow for what was historically generative and productive about that moment, not in the sense of good, but in the sense of not the end. And to see what might come after deindustrialization, to imagine new kinds of working class universalisms, I think we have to trace out the unfolding of all the contradictions that came before it, so that we can see ourselves in our own position, not in a vacuum defined by an absence, but in an environment where history is still developing and being made. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening, and look forward to your questions.
All right. Thanks so much for that talk, Gabriel. I've really appreciated it. And I think you gave everyone so much to chew on. And at this point in time, I would like to open the floor up to questions. And I think we can do this two ways. I think it's easier for me if you post your question in the chat box so that I know who to call on. But if not, you can also use the emojis to raise your hand, and I will try to find you. And go ahead and allow you to ask the question that way. Also want to take a moment while we're waiting for folks to formulate their questions to remind everyone to consider joining the Labor and Working Class History Organization. There's a link in the chat, and also to remind you that we have these chats once a month, every month on a Thursday around the middle of the month. And the next chat is Angela Vergara fighting unemployment in the 20th century Chile on September 16th at 7 p.m. Okay. Gabe, is there any part of the book that you would like to take this moment to expand on?
God, I feel like I really tried to compress it all in there.
I think you did an excellent job.
Well, I guess, I think I really, I especially probably rushed through the late parts of the book, after the early 1980s, I alluded to this kind of Medicare reform, which the final chapter of the book discusses. I'll just talk about that. Oh, so there's a hand up. Let me stop. There's a hand up.
So Eileen has a hand up. Go ahead, Eileen. You want to ask your question?
Yeah, of course, I love this book. I got to read it for the press. So, I mean, I feel, I don't feel critical of it. My question relates to where you end in the historiography, really. And it seems to me that another aspect of our historical moment is the transnational turn. So how do we, given our, not a search for synthesis, not a search, but trying not to engage in fragmentation, talk on these various levels of the micro, the macro, from the household and reproductive labor to the shifts in the structure of a national economy to the transnational turn? in terms
Yeah, I
of,
mean, it's a great question. I don't know that I have the answer. I would be curious what others here would say. I guess it seems to me like one element of the transformation of the field, and I think Leon could just as easily have included this along with outsiders and institutions,
mm,
right? Is, I mean, he could just have easily included the point you just made. One element of the change is that the working class of auto workers and steel workers and coal miners was a working class that was in a national economy, right? That was what made possible in some way elements of the political economy of post-war growth and working class economic inclusion to the extent it existed. And certainly in steel, the story of the decline of employment is a story of international competition more than anything else. I think that what that meant was significant identification between the labor movement and a certain kind of American nationalism that became a very painfully evident if we look back on the Cold War in particular. And I don't know exactly what the methodological answer to your question is, but I do think that there's probably more. I mean, I know that there are scholars in LAWCHA, maybe in the audience here, who have done really good research on labor's Cold War in different ways. But I think the end of the Cold War and the decline of the industrial unions maybe opens up space in a kind of similar way, I think and hope for and that, or probably is the reason that space has opened up for transnational work in a different kind of way. But I would sort of defer to someone who actually does that kind of work.
I think we have another question here coming from Amy Loisel. Amy, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. So I know that, like Gabe, I really try to balance and keep the workers and labor in focus, but I'm really interested in things like the finance capital. And I just thought of this when he showed the skyscraper that now belongs to, the medical center, like kind of what, if he'd at all examine the role of finance and who's kind of financing this shift. Even though the early years of the hospital is kind of like, labor intensive with low wage labor, that eventually there is that shift to needing to finance, commercial real estate and technology. And so I was just curious about some of that.
Yeah. So in the early 70s, Allegheny County established a, what is it called? Allegheny County Hospital Development Authority, a public authority of the kind that Gail Radford's book is about. To give hospitals and nursing homes access to municipal debt markets or municipal bond markets. And that, I mean, in the urban kind of northern context, that has been the main mechanism by which hospital expansion has happened. When hospitals borrow, they can pass through their, basically their interest payments. They can make Medicare pay them. And so what that means is that it's very much in the interest, if to the extent the demand is there, as it really steadily was for much of the kind of middle and late 20th century, it's very much in the interest of every hospital to borrow and build. Now, eventually, particularly after the Medicare reform, which was meant to put the market discipline squeeze on hospitals, some found that they had overbuilt in this way, and the largest nonprofit hospital bankruptcy in U.S. history is a Pittsburgh hospital. It was called AHRF, Allegheny Health and Education and Research Foundation, in late 1990s, basically overexpanded and went belly up. But by and large, hospitals had and continue to have access to subsidized debt. And that has been the kind of main mechanism.
We're gonna move to the next question from Bob Bussell. Bob, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, yeah, thanks. It's in the chat. I just would briefly expand, and Gabriel, great talk, by the way. Much enjoyed it. This is maybe 30 years ago. I was in Western Pennsylvania in a small mining town called Gallitzin, and there was a little museum there. And as I say in the chat, there's the person who was the curator said to me, we used to have an economy that was based on mines and steel mills, and now it's nursing homes and prisons. And said that with a lot of wistfulness and lament in the voice. I was just wondering if the prison labor issue, you briefly alluded to it, and we, of course, all the things we know now about mass incarceration, if that came up at all in your research.
Yeah, I mean, more than coming up in my research, I'll say it came up as a kind of analogy that I couldn't resist, and found that it kept suggesting itself to me. You know, thinking about Ruth Wilson Gilmore's argument about the way that the prison system in California offered a kind of political and economic solution to, you know, various parallel versions of the crises that I was talking about today, you know, the kind of Fordist economy. It's not that, I mean, in the case of a place like Pittsburgh, it's not that prison labor has that big of a footprint in the labor market, or even if you went out to, you know, the mill towns 30 miles outside Pittsburgh, Aliquippa and these kinds of places. It's not that prison, you know, that many people are working in the prison system. It's that the prison system is carrying out a social function that is in some way comparable to, especially if you think about nursing homes. And I always want to be careful when I say this because, you know, I think that we shouldn't have prisons, basically. And I think that, you know, it's important to have systems and even institutions of elder care. So it's not, you know, you can't make a very straightforward equivalency. But I do think basically we can say economic restructuring in the late 20th century generated surplus populations. And to the extent that policymakers or investors or combinations of policymakers and private investors could figure out how to manage displaced people, either, you know, displaced in terms of age or in terms of unemployment and race, right, that they could then attract capital and attract public revenue. And so that the way that the state, I mean, these are both industries of social reproduction in some way. One is a kind of violent industry of social reproduction, but I think we can see the kind of parallel playing out. And, you know, I think that that allows us to kind of then think of political thought about, okay, the state actually is in charge of keeping a lot of the population alive in one way or another. What would it mean to try to, you know, democratize that task, make it more emancipatory and less repressive, if we see, you know, these different industries kind of in relation to each other?
Okay. Our next question comes from Will Raby. Will, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
So I'm curious, it's like if this story would look different, you know, told from like the perspective of the U.S. South, you know, particularly the parts, you know, like here in North Carolina that have had, you know, pretty heavy deindustrialization in industries like textiles and also like runaway shops that you know, kind of came down over here for about, you know, 20, 30 years and then also left. So you've got, you know, large swaths of, you know, rust belts in the South where you know, and these tended to not have great health benefits, and they tended to, you know, be the kinds of places where you kind of had the rolling out of PPOs and managed care because, you know, they didn't have good union protections to keep all that nonsense from intruding. And if, you know, nowadays you've got, you know, a lot of healthcare consolidation and you know, UNC health system is always, you know, buying up regional hospital systems, and of course like the kind of inspiring example of Mission Hospital in Nashville that unionized after a nationwide for-profit chain bought them. You know, so it just seems that there is a story to be told in Southern healthcare, but it's and its relationship to a different kind of industrial economy. And I'm just curious if you think that story would complicate the unionized urban CIO type story that you told, or if it's really something that kind of needs to be understood in like as an offshoot of your story.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I don't totally know the answer off the top of my head. In general, it's striking that even in places in the Sun Belt, which are demographically relatively older, you don't find as large healthcare workforces as you find in, you know, the kind of northern Rust Belt places, because they're not old in the same way, right? Retirees in Arizona or Florida are not the same kind of old folks as sociologically as you find in Pittsburgh. However, in rural places as well, right? There's, I mean, it's a kind of complicated and different story. I haven't thought that much about the industrial or the formerly industrial South, to be honest. I would think that some of the effect I'm describing here probably obtains even in the absence of collective bargaining and strong unions and good, you know, good welfare, healthcare benefits. Some of it is probably still there, just in the way that industrial towns tend to anchor poorer older folks in place. and the ways that, Medicare and Medicaid are, well, Medicare is national and Medicaid is sort of national. So you can kind of find the effects that those contribute to the story I'm telling in other places to some degree, but I think it would not be identical.
And our next question comes from Joe McCartan. Joe, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Joe, are you still with us? I don't see him. We're going to move on to Nick Unger.
Hi, thank you. Well, first a quick comment. The creation of surplus population, based on your comment of continuity, is a permanent feature as opposed to a specific. I mean, there's particularities to who the surplus population is, but I'm not sure that you can get away with localizing it the way you did, as opposed to it's always a feature, it just is a matter of who gets picked. Which gets me to the question that I'd like you to pursue more on this working class universalism in the historiography. It strikes me that the universal wasn't universal, and that the field of working class universalism is either it's vulgar Marxism or it's racist American exceptionalism, pick one, but it was never universal. And that the theory, the CIO view that that's the universal stand-in for the working class bought us 30 or 40 years later quite a bit of damage, and that locating the working class in white men was ideologically wrong and technically grossly inaccurate. And so it always missed who the working class was and defined folks differently. And so the argument you're making around working class universalism, could you elaborate a little more on this? The transformation to a mainly women of color workforce is either working class regeneration because they always were part of the working class, or what? And I got a little lost at that point.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Well, let me address the first part first on the question of surplus population. There is always, relative surplus population. It's necessary, obviously, for capital accumulation. It defines capitalist labor markets. But that, as you say, who is in it in a given time does change, and quantities change. As a place becomes more, as a place deindustrializes and it has a large older population, a larger unemployed population, a larger imprisoned population, what you're seeing is a kind of quantitative increase in the expulsion of workers from labor markets. And so I think, the historical specifics of that are important for us to track, which goes then to your next question. I basically agree with what you're saying. I think that obviously the kind of high tide of the labor movement in the middle of the 20th century, I think it was reasonable to believe, as many did at the time, and our predecessors who would have been in an equivalent organization to this one, many of them would have believed at the time, that there would be knock-on emancipatory effects as the labor movement became stronger, and won its struggles with both employers and also inside the Democratic Party and this kind of thing, such that its unevenness and inequalities and exclusions were kind of unfortunate details to work out over time, as opposed to structural components of it. Now, I don't think that's right. And I think part of what I'm trying to argue is that at least since the 40s and since Taft-Hartley, and maybe going back even further, what the labor movement understood as economic security, in fact, depended on having outsiders who were more vulnerable. But I think, it's with the advantage of time and looking in retrospect that becomes clearer. And I think it becomes possible to tell a story like the one I'm telling today. since the 1740s. I mean, there's certainly a way. I mean, I don't disagree with that either necessarily.
So we have our next question coming from Nate Holdren, but I think I'm going to go ahead and ask his question for him. He indicated he's on childcare duty, and it might be easier if I go ahead and ask it. So here we go. He says, "Great talk, thank you. If I may associate your work with a renewal of interest in versions of Marxism. If I'm right, I'd be interested in you talking about that, either biographical or cohort terms, as you did at the end of your talk, or in terms of how it informs your book and your agenda for it."
Sure, thanks, Nate. I just finished your book, which is great. Yeah, I mean, I think when I started grad school, which was 2010, it was the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. And I mean, I think people wanted to figure out how to do Marxist work, to understand what was happening in one form or another. That brought various kinds of professional anxieties and so on, obviously. And, how to kind of renew a certain kind of political and theoretical tradition while doing empirical work is obviously a challenge. It has to kind of get figured out in every generation. But I guess for me, the thing I'll say, and there's a lot of things I could say to this, but just in the vein of the conversation we're having here, I think the last decade has been a really, in particular, kind of lively discussion and revival of Marxist feminist traditions from the 70s and, since and before. And those informed my research really powerfully and directly. And I benefited a lot from having people around me who were reading Sylvia Federici and reading Selma James and, reading Lise Vogel and telling me to read these things. And in particular, the key mediating book for me, and I think for a lot of my friends, was Kathy Weeks's book, The Problem with Work, which, I think really raised a question about what she calls productivism in working class struggle, the linking of working class power and well-being to the ability to produce economic output. That's something that she criticizes and problematizes very effectively and powerfully, and got me thinking about what does it mean to have all of this labor capacity flowing into these lines of activity that, it's not that they're not work, whether it's obviously it's a work to work in a nursing home, but which in some way don't have all of the same features that an industrial workplace had in terms of increasing productivity over time, and that generates contradictions in these workplaces that then, and in these labor processes and the workers' experience, that then make it possible, I think, for us to imagine, let me put it like this. I think to have a humane care economy, you couldn't really be in capitalism anymore, right? There's just a deep contradiction, I think, between providing care in a commodified way, through wage labor, as we do now, and the whole rest of the structure of our society. And as more and more of our economy is in care, I think that contradiction grows more intense. So that's the kind of deep Marxist hope and idea of the book. And I got that from that, especially in many places, but especially from the kind of Marxist feminist revival.
Okay, our next question will come from Leonore Teifer. Leonore, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, just do healthcare workers think of themselves as workers? And this identity issue, is there an analogy from other areas of labor history that would inform this shift in identity that would then predict forms of organizing and so on?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I've thought a lot about, and obviously people on the left and in the labor movement have been thinking about and writing about for a very long time. I mean, you can find Barbara and John Ehrenreich writing great stuff on this question in the early 1970s. Healthcare is a very stratified industry occupationally, much more so even than the industry we often compare it to, which is public education. And so that means it's difficult to generalize about it in some ways. And generally, from the healthcare workers I know and have talked to, in the lower strata, people think of themselves as workers, certainly, and generally have fewer of the kind of, ideological identification with the work and with the boss that you sometimes kind of find in industries that have industries like healthcare and education. I love my work so much, I would do it for free. I think you find less of that with people who, are the custodians or even the nursing assistants in many cases, although they still do find themselves going above and beyond all of the time. And I think, every nursing home in the country, if you walked in and talked to a nursing assistant about the last year, they would have stories for you like that. But that doesn't mean that they're confused about their role, right? The fact that they're willing to make sure people get taken care of doesn't mean that they don't think of themselves as workers. Climb up the ladder a couple notches to technicians and certainly nurses and doctors, I think you start to find more of the kind of classic contradictions around professional ideology that are common, obviously, again, in education and higher ed. And there's such a huge range of difference that how to actually articulate a common identity of healthcare worker is not at all straightforward. There's racial and gender differentiation that maps that occupational stratification. So, I think, if you really wanted to think about historical analogies, actually, the steel industry a century ago is not a bad one, or even more than a century ago in the late 19th century, where all of these differences of skill that are also differences of race and ethnicity that mean that there's not really necessarily a common sense of what a worker is. And I think that's a real political project to establish that.
And the last question of the night comes from Deborah Cohen. Deborah, did you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Okay. So I want to pick up on the last question and Eileen's first question, which was about to look at this national story from a transnational lens. In the 1970s, you get a major increase in immigration. You get not especially, but as well, you get the immigration of Filipino workers and doctors from South Asia, which are the two places I know about at least a little. And so I wonder how and they complicate what you were just talking about in terms of stratification about race, because you have to add language and nationality into this complicated mix. So I would like your perspective on the ways that immigration and the big increase in immigration after, by the late 60s, especially early 70s, and throughout the period in question, how that complicates the story you're trying to tell, and how looking at it might give clues that we haven't yet, or you haven't yet thought about.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's one I get often and struggle with, because Pittsburgh, just as it happens, was not that much of a destination for a lot of those migration streams. And so the story that is generally very true that you're describing was less true there. And so I'm less knowledgeable about it than I should be. But I think obviously the one complication that story adds is the dynamic I kind of, I sort of half seriously alluded to before, where, like, father becomes a patient, his daughter becomes a nurse, and there she is in the hospital taking care of him. Right, that's more complicated, obviously, when actually the healthcare labor market is being staffed through these global migration streams. And I think in some way raises the bar. I think this is what you're getting at, raises the bar on questions of solidarity, both among workers and between workers and patients, which are absolutely critical, right? Those solidarities, I think there's no way to imagine either more workers' power in this industry, which is the largest industry in the country, or a more humane healthcare system. We can't have either of those things without figuring out how workers and have solidarity with one another and with patients. And, frankly, that's easier to imagine, I think, in a straightforward way. I mean, forget Pittsburgh, in like Johnstown, Pennsylvania, right, where the hospital is the largest employer, or any coal town where the health system is the largest employer, and where you really have that kind of direct generational transmission. I think the kind of diversification of that workforce complicates that, but also probably generates opportunity, because it brings in all different kinds of streams of political experience and political, ideology and history that workers carry with them. And I think I mean, Filipino workers, for example, in the last year have been Filipino nurses have been extremely militant in a lot of the resistance to dangerous working conditions in hospitals, and have died at very high rates as well. And so I think that I don't know how that all shakes out exactly, and I think it's something I want to think more about and talk more about. But I think that it's complicated in a bunch of different ways politically. Sorry for that kind of mixed answer.
All right, well, that about wraps it up. Thank you so much for joining us, Gabe, and thank you for giving us your time. Everybody really, I think, seemed to enjoy the talk, and the questions were great. Thank you all for coming. And I hope that everyone joins us next week, or next month rather, with Angela Vergara, Fighting Unemployment in 20th Century Chile, September 16th. So I hope to see everybody then. And thank you for coming.
Thanks for